everybody. Uh, Welcome to the first episode of the Infinite Library, the Good Books podcast. Uh, uh, I'm John. I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Ben.
So thank you so much for joining us. If you're listening to this, we appreciate you taking a risk on a new podcast. Know that it's not always an easy thing to do. Ben, before we get started with our topic for today, let's take a minute and kind of talk about the show and ourselves and I think what kind of our goals are here.
If you saw this podcast, you're probably wondering just what is the Infinite Library? Well, the Infinite Library is a sort of mystical space that you enter as soon as you purchase more books than your bookshelves can hold. It's the very moment that you start stacking your books lengthwise across books you already have to, in effect, wall in the books that you enter the Infinite Library. And the point of the Infinite Library is that, listen, there's a lot of demands for our attention right now. And if you're already listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in reading. So how do you decide what to read? There's so many books out there. Maybe you just buy them because you think you're going to buy time to read them later. How do you decide how do you read a book? What do you want to get out of it? That's what we do here at the Infinite Library is we want to make a space to read about books in a way that is good for this sort of attention demand economy that we're in. And, and also if you're here, you probably already love books enough that you're considering stacking them lengthwise because you bought too many. So hopefully you'll find yourself among good company.
Yeah, when you have to make that tough decision to sacrifice aesthetics and start stacking them lengthwise, a little part of your soul is snipped off and transported to the Infinite Library. And Ben and I, we're your companions here, and we're gonna spend some time talking about books. Reading it's a solitary activity for the most part, as many great readers through history have noted. Bloom, Montaigne, etc. But we want to make sure that there is a space where we can chat about this stuff and just think about books and talk about books and enjoy books. But I think also enjoy them in a way that's we're not here to just hump the canon and talk have the same conversations we've had a million times. We want to talk about literature in a way that is fun and interesting and treats even older texts with a vitality that I think is often lacking in a lot of literary spaces. So that's kind of our baseline here. Obviously the show will develop as we go, but that is kind of where we're starting from. So let's dig into our topic for today. So Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. Ben and I decided to start off with one that has a not quite infinite library, but a labyrinthine one, nevertheless.
The one which is whose contents are very tightly controlled, lest a stray monk wander in and read, the Solomon's Pentagram handbook or other sort of we could say heretical ideas. So it seemed like the perfect book to start this off. Also because it's a book that I think is concerned with what makes reading worthwhile and how a lot of books lead to other books and how one could easily lose their way if they're not careful.
Yeah. So a little background here. Ben, I think you took a little bit more of the lead on this part of the research, but just kind of to get us started, this was a book published in Italian in 1980. The author, Umberto Eco, very famous Italian semiotician. You might know him from that list of characteristics of fascism that started floating around the internet around 2016.
Yeah, fascism. Yeah,
fascism. But he also wrote some very, very great, cool novels. I'm sure Name of the Rose is not the only one we're going to talk about. But yeah, Ben, tell us a little bit about this book and kind of when it came out and what the response was like. And yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you pretty much covered it, John. But in 1980 in Italian, translated in 1983 into English, and it sold something like 50 million copies, which is something I find kind of interesting because I don't. And Eco is quoted in saying this: "This book doesn't really make it easy. In fact, he considered the first 100 pages as sort of the uphill climb into the book, and editors told him, you should cut it down. This is too much." And he just refused. He said, no. He basically said, this is what you have to do to get into the book. He says it's penance, which I think is oddly fitting for the religious themes of this book, that the reader has to pay their penance on the first 100 pages. And also it was written as kind of a way, as far as I could tell, although Eco won't say this directly, as a way of working out one of his ideas from semiotics, because he was a semiotician, which is the study of signs, of the open work, which is a work that kind of creates its own ideal reader. And, you know, in the back of the book, if you have a copy with the postscript, he will say something like, if somebody asks him this, he'll just deny it. But people have sort of drawn the connection as well. So in terms of background, it's meant to, again, evoke a 14th century work written by a monk. It's meant to involve semiotics. And it's also, again, was incredibly popular. And we don't have to get into this, but there is something that I had found a while ago online that I can't find now because I wanted to bring it up on this podcast, was that Eco probably influenced Dan Brown. And maybe you're familiar with the idea of this sort of like, you know, thrilling medieval detective novel. But Eco, to all intents and purposes, one of the first ones to ever do it. And Dan Brown's probably picked up where he started. In fact, there's a quote where Eco insists that he invented Dan Brown. He says, Dan Brown is a character of one of mine. Also, somebody asked him if he's read, I think it was Da Vinci Code, and he says, yes, I'm guilty of that too. He's
a funny guy.
Yeah, he's a great man. But yeah, so sort of thrilling historical detective novel. And I think that's everything I wanted to mention that wasn't plot, unless there's something else.
Yeah. Well, then let's start digging into that plot a little bit. Not to be trite, but I do think that to really discuss this book in any detail, we do have to start with a bit of a plot summary. I think, Ben, you and I chatted a little bit about this before we started recording. The Infinite Library, for better or worse, is we're an anti-spoilers podcast, not in that we think spoilers are bad, in that we don't think the concept of spoilers is useful, and we're not probably going to indulge it a lot over the course of the show. And
I would add, too, that I feel like, you know, if you're reading a book, you're probably into it the way a story is told rather than what it's told. And, you know, I know some people will tell me like, well, if you spoil it, you ruin it. But I mean, we're here to sort of take some time to read stuff on our own. And I think we're more into like the how rather than the what, if you want to put it that way. And I think especially for Name of the Rose, it doesn't really matter. And we'll get into that later. One of the ways it wrongfoots you is sort of presenting itself as a detective story, which I think is on purpose. So yeah.
Let's summarize that plot a little bit. So we start with a very interesting introduction, which purports to be not quite a journal entry, but a preface to a text. Doesn't quite make clear what exactly this text is. It's not clear if it's the novel itself, if it's something else. We start with a seemingly contemporaneous narrator to the book's publication in 1980. There are some mentions of Soviet troops invading Prague, is kind of the kickoff event here. And this narrator, this contemporary narrator, discovers this mysterious manuscript purporting to be the words of Adso of Milk, a 13th century or 13th or 14th century.
I think
1327.
Yeah,
14th century monk of the Benedictine order, telling of some very strange happenings. This guy is clearly very well read and well versed in a lot of languages. So he does a translation of the text, though he is somewhat skeptical of its authenticity.
And we should add, too, that there is a Frenchman who also translated the original Adso of Milk text into French. And so I think supposedly the other translator is Italian. So there's another degree of sort of removal from the story itself, too.
Yes, we are reading a English translation of an Italian translation of a French translation of a Latin piece of writing, purportedly. Again, even the Italian narrator does not seem 100% convinced that the text he's working with is genuine. But that gets us into the text itself. So Adso of Melk, 13th century monk. He's writing this as an old man reflecting on events of his youth. This particular event is when he was wandering through northern Italy with a learned Franciscan whose care he had been entrusted to by his parents. And this learned Franciscan, one William of Baskerville, is a former inquisitor who is taking part in a sort of theological debate that is slated to happen at this unnamed monastery in northern Italy that serves as the primary setting for the book. So they arrive. This library is, within the world of the book, holds the largest library in the Roman West at this point. And monks come from all over the world to study there, from all different orders, even though it's technically a Benedictine monastery. And when they arrive, they discover that a mysterious death has taken place recently. A young, very talented illuminator, which, for those who don't know, is a painter of manuscripts in the medieval tradition, has died under very strange circumstances. It seems like a suicide, but no one can quite place how he would have killed himself. So they have basically considered a murder. And the abbot asks William, who is known for his intelligence and his canniness with investigation, to look into the matter. And to kind of make a long story short, Adso and William believe that they are caught up in the plot of a serial killer who is murdering monks in a series of killings that mirror the biblical apocalypse. However, at the end of the novel, it is revealed that, surprise, there was no murderer at all. There was merely a series of contrived, mostly coincidences that gave the appearance of murder, but were actually kicked off by one very old, bitter man not wanting people to read a joke book.
Right, because the joke book could undo everything that the monastery and Christianity has accomplished.
Yes. And so at the very end, the monastery is burned to the ground through another series of contrived circumstances. All the books are destroyed, including the perfidious joke book. And Adso and William are left asking, what did any of this mean? And wouldn't you know it, by the end of it, no one has a good answer.
Nobody has a good answer. Adso eventually returns to the site and collects the scraps of the library. And from those scraps, he creates what he sort of refers to as like a personal manuscript that he consults almost religiously, if it were a Bible. And then after doing so, he also concludes, the best days are behind me. and then the book ends. Yeah, and the world. And then the book just ends. So as you can see, it's not, I mean, it purports to be a detective novel, but once the plot is revealed, it turns out that all of these explanations that William of Baskerville keeps putting forth as to who killed who and why, they all sort of fall away before the idea that it was just a series of misunderstandings.
Yeah. So Ben, obviously this is an incredibly dense text. I think that a lot has been said and written about this book over the years, and that is because it is a puzzle box of a book. There is so much here. We're only really going to scratch the surface in our discussion here today. Even if we probably talk about this for a week, we would still find more things to talk about. Yeah. But where do you want to start?
So I think it might be useful to start with the fact that William of Baskerville may be Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, absolutely.
And what we mean by that? It's clearly not Baskerville. I mean, Hounds of Baskervilles. That's clear Sherlock Holmes reference. But almost from the beginning, Eco uses word for word sections of Conan Doyle's work. There's one significant one involving a drug that William of Baskerville uses to think more clearly. And it's described in almost the same way as when I believe Sherlock Holmes uses cocaine, I think, unless it's a different thing. Yeah.
He finds this herb, he chews it, and the book is told in first person from Adzo's perspective, and Adzo's like, yeah, he just got very chill and very like clear-minded. And I asked him what it was, and he was like, what's good for an aged Franciscan is bad for a young Benedictine. And that's good on him. He's a responsible caretaker.
And speaking of which, John had found an article where they talk about that it might be some sort of cannabis-like substance. And when I was reading that, I'm like, it's no way to tell. It just helps him think clearly. But then a lot later, when he's thinking about the library, he starts saying things that I believe only a stoned person would say, where he goes like, our head is different inside the library than outside. And Adzo's like, what are you talking about? So like, I'm not saying it's exactly weed, but there's some sort of the implication is you can use it to think better. But if it's set in the 14th century, why is Eco deliberately calling to mind Sherlock Holmes? And I think there's probably a couple reasons to talk about this. One is he wants you to sort of expect that it's going to proceed as if it's a detective novel. But two, Eco, being a semiotician, believes that all signs speak to other signs. Books speak of other books, which is something Baskerville says at one point. And, every time you reference something, you're in fact looking or working with things that happened before. And so it sort of it serves as this cue that every time you're reading this, you're reading, one, the 14th century setting, but also things that speak to your own life, some of which are deliberately anachronistic, one of them being Baskerville, but other things happen later that are like that. We can talk about them as we come up. But one of the points of the book,
I was going to say, William is a disciple of sort of Holmesian deductive reasoning. So Adzo at several points says that his master reads the natural world as if it were a great book. So there are many, many scenes of William kind of preempting people when they're conversing with him, kind of knowing what they're going to tell him before they tell him it, because, wouldn't you know it, he saw some footprints in the snow, and he knows, it was a horse of this size that walked by, 10 minutes ago, because he's just got that sharp a brain.
And he uses the name that every person in a convent would name a horse, which is Brunellus. I didn't actually look up the reference, but he's like, of course, anybody in a convent would name a beloved horse Brunellus. So,
So, but again, there's this idea that there are human reason looks for signs in the world, and we import meaning into them. But the question this book has is, even when we're reading the natural world, like how accurate are these symbolic connections we make? How much can we trust what seems to be a relatively straightforward crime scene or, scene of any activity? We believe that our rational minds can look at a series of events or clues or objects around us, and we can impute some kind of truth from that, some kind of chain of events or understanding of what's happening around us.
Or like a general principle, like this is what
But at the end of the day, how much can we trust our own faculties in that sense?
And along those lines, I would say that the book teaches Adzo to do this by, him being the sort of elder monk. He instructs Adzo to form principles based on deduction, to look at basically details and extrapolate further as to what caused them. But the end result, as John was hinting out, is that this is a very tough process and it doesn't often work. Sometimes it works, like for instance with Brunellus, but often William of Baskerville has multiple explanations for what caused a sign or what a sign means, and he doesn't know how to differentiate and say it was one or the other. So he says we must be very careful when we're differentiating between causes. And I think that in a way relates to Eco makes sure to point out that, one, William of Baskerville is a Franciscan, which means he has a high value on poverty as something that was practiced by both Christ and the apostles. And he would have known what I can't remember what Occam's first name is. Occam's razor. What is his name?
William of Occam, I think.
Yeah, William of Occam he would have been talking to William of Ockham, and of course, Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation is always the true one. So he's constantly formulating explanations for these signs in the world, many of which purport to a crime scene. And he's always like, well, Occam says they got to be the most simplest one. And one of the reasons Eco says that he did this is because he wanted somebody to be a semiotician and also a detective who would have been in that period. Well, he would have had to know William of Ockham. And so he sort of like says, well, that means he would have had to have been a Franciscan. And so suddenly we get these like very specific characters that have goals that, you know, in this detective story. And one of which of like John touched on in the summary, we may not have time to get on, is this sort of debate about poverty in Christ. But to circle back to what you were saying, this premise of deducing meaning from the world and from signs is a fraught one. And I think the book sort of convinces you that maybe it's going to work to help solve this murder, and then it doesn't. Yes. Which is sort of like one of the twists. So
something that I studied a little bit of, wasn't semiotic, like it was not semiotics specifically, but I took some courses on medieval thought, in particular medieval scientific and religious thought when I was in my undergraduate career. And I specifically studied bestiaries. I wrote a paper on bestiaries when I was in my undergrad, and there was a belief in the medieval Western Church. I do not know if there was a corresponding thought in the Eastern Church, but in the Western Church, that essentially the natural world was a mirror of the divine world. You know, this is an idea that we see obviously coming down through Plato, that, you know, earthly things are a reflection of heavenly things. And that's where the bestiary tradition comes out of, the idea that by observing animals, you can learn Christian truths. By observing the natural world, you can observe Christian truths. There are a lot of characters in this book who subscribe to this thought process. The abbot in particular is obsessed with what he calls the language of gems. He believes that all the various precious stones which adorn his monastery through the vast wealth it's built up over the ages, they all speak to these distinctive heavenly virtues that they are reflections of in the earthly world. And that his wealth is therefore, in some sense, justified because of the heavenly virtues that they represent. He's preserving virtue by hoarding all this wealth. But again, it's one of these things where, the bestiary tradition is somewhat spurious because it's all somewhat made up. It's either people misobserving animals or making stuff up or reading stuff that like Aristotle or some other, you know, earlier Greek or Roman writers wrote. You know, Isidore of Seville is kind of one of the roots of the bestiary tradition, and you know, he's cribbing a lot of his stuff from Aristotle. And, you know, there's this idea that, we want to look at the world and we want it to tell us some higher truth. We want it to reveal something to us. We want to be able to look at something long enough, whether that's a rock or an animal, and we want to come away from that with some deeper understanding of the world. And this is kind of, I think, for Eco, he sees that this is where his discipline of semiotics comes out of, this search for truth in symbols. But what at some point is realized by that study, or, you know, what our two characters realize at the end of this book, is that most of the time, if you're looking at a symbol, you're not looking at a real thing. I mean, you're looking at a real thing. You're looking at a real rock, or you're looking at a lion or a bear. But that truth you're imputing onto that is not truth.
Or it could be, you can easily find another truth that almost contradicts it.
Exactly.
Especially in the discourse of the gems bit, it's great because, like a detective novel, this has a classic getting taken off the case scene. And at one point, Adso is like, listen, you're starting to reflect too poor, not Adso, Abo, you're reflecting too poorly on this monastery. I need you to stop investigating these murders. And then after he says that, he starts riffing about the gems, and William gets very pissed off, and he's like, wow, what a great gem I have. Please stop investigating this. And of course, from, William's Franciscan perspective, these gems are hoarding wealth that could be used to better serve the community. So we can arrive at two separate truths from one thing, the existence of the gem. How do we differentiate between the two? So,
well, not even that, even the abbot himself, as he's looking at the gems, he starts listing what their various qualities are, but the different gems have different qualities depending on whose words he's quoting. He has all these like learned men and saints who he believes have explicated this heavenly language that he is an expert on, but they have contradictory beliefs about what these stones represent, because at the end of the day, they're not actually referencing a real thing. They're referencing other things. They're assigning these things qualities based on their, associations, maybe with the color, maybe with the hardness or something, the various material qualities. When we're referencing symbols, a lot of times we're not referencing a literal truth. We're referencing another symbol.
Yeah. Right. And specifically, folks, if you ever want to read theory, you usually find out that you just have to read all of the theory, much like how symbols reference other symbols. When you start reading theory, you realize theory references other theories. And, we don't have time. We're in the infinite library. If only we had enough time to read all these theories. So I'd always advertise cheating a little bit. And there's a illustrated series on theoretical topics. One of them is called Introducing Semiotics. And in Introducing Semiotics, the section on eco mentions a thing which is drawing from the American semiotician, whose name is, I forgot his first name again. I just wanted to look it up real quick. The last name is Peirce. I believe his first name is, hold on. It is, oh yeah. Well, I think it might be William Peirce. Hold on. I feel like we're touching on a lot of Williams. Charles Peirce, unlimited semiosis. So it's when signs only refer to other signs. It's when, and this is something John has pointed out, it's when you could always come up with a word for something else. As soon as you're trying to describe a phenomenon, you use things taken from elsewhere. And, the point that Eco says, or rather this Introducing Semiotics text says, which is actually, you can read it for free on archive.org, which is pretty dope. But
we'll have it in the show notes.
Yeah, it'll definitely be in the show notes. Basically, that this unlimited semiosis is productive because at some point for Eco, in making sense of this unlimited semiosis, you develop a habit, which is the way that you interpret the world. And I think a more positive reading of Name of the Rose, which I'm not going to discount the negative one, is that you, the reader, and having to make sense of this book will come away with a habit that you can use to make sense of the world, even if it's a habit that relies on constant referral from one thing to the other thing. At least you have a sort of disposition to do that, which is what he thinks is sort of the end result of the open work. And I think that's what William tries to give Adso at the end, because they have sort of a tragic ending, but they sort of discuss what you're supposed to do in this world to make sense of it. But yeah, I do enjoy the gem scene a lot just because he keeps listing gems and William is like, I don't have time for this. Like, we have to catch the murderer. And he's just like, and an emerald speaks to chastity and a sapphire speaks to truth. And
Cyprian says,
yeah. And he's like having Adso kiss the ring. And, that's not what we want from a detective story, but it contains kind of the truth that I think Eco was getting at.
let's take a step back real quick. Then I feel like we're kind of bobbing and weaving a little bit here. Let's try to drill down on like some of our topics here we wanted to get to. So one thing I want to talk about, just kind of getting back to the very beginning of the book, and then we can kind of start marching our way through. I wanted to talk about narrators. This is again a book about, I think in a lot of ways, about how we can't trust our own judgment a lot of times. And I think that goes for like us as readers. I think it also goes for the narration of the book, both the nameless narrator at the beginning, who I think might be Eco. I'm not 100% sure. I think that there's an implication that it's supposed to be Eco, but he doesn't like sign it off as himself in the text. And I also think Adso himself is an unreliable narrator. I guess just kind of to start with the very beginning, what did you think of the introduction?
I think we're supposed to, if you're a careful reader, he mentions finding one of these manuscripts in Buenos Aires, and it's related to another manuscript on mirrors.
Yes, which the use of mirrors in the game of chess.
Right,
Milo Temivasar.
I wonder if that involves like cheating, like looking at the mirror or something. Anyway, but I think that's supposed to be like a Borges reference, and I think
again, if we want a lot of Borges here, I think we're going to get to him in a little bit when we talk about characters.
Right, but without getting ahead of it too quick, I will say that I think when you read that, I think you might be inclined to start saying, well, maybe this sort of text is already infected with a bunch of other stuff. And so like the unreliableness is sort of like you're getting a mixed signal. You're not getting like the truth. The signal is always like mixed with like other things. One of them, and that's kind of like Borges has a piece about that with the Pierre Menard, where the guy tries to write Don Quixote. And so like the writing Don Quixote is mixed with the experiences of the person reading it and with the person who wants to write Don Quixote, even though it's already been written, which is nonsensical. But I think like, the unreliable narrator is a way of like mixing in signal or noise into the signal. So
yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot in there. There's a passage here where he mentions that the copy that he has, this French copy, is clearly has references that were added later, specifically around herbs. He says there are references to the work of Albertus Magnus, which was in circulation at this time, but the specific version that would have had these references was not in circulation until much later. So I think, again, there's not an answer here at the end of the day. I think that's unfortunately, we want to be able to sit down. We want to be able to just like put our glasses on and just like stare at the text like SpongeBob with our eyes like hitting the page and moving up and down,
pulsating out.
But there's not an answer, and that's the point. Which I think that goes for Adso's narration too. I think that this is my second time reading this book. I had read it once before. I had it read to me. I did the audiobook. I used to be a delivery driver, and I listened to a lot of audiobooks at the time, and I listened to this one, and it was very interesting, very different experience reading versus being read to, regardless of the book. But particularly this one, I did not put together a lot of the more subtle touches until this read through. And one of those that I realized is like, Adso never at any point in this text is like, oh, I have a photographic memory, that's how I'm reporting all this stuff with like perfect accuracy. Like there are books that do that. They purport, the narrator just says like, yeah, I have like a perfect memory. Obviously not a trustworthy narrator, but that's something that Gene Wolfe does in the Book of the New Sun. Severian like starts off that book just like, I remember everything, don't worry about it. Which in that case is him probably lying. But anyway,
the narrator doth protest too much.
Adso never says that. He's constantly referencing in this book that he's so old now, like he's but he remembers enough of this to like lay out a 500-page narrative,
with detailed maps and explanations and lists of information too. There's a lot of just perfect recall.
Which I think is an interesting touch. I didn't catch a whole lot of instances where like I was like, he's misremembering this, because again, when you reach the, like, I found myself looking for that the whole way through the book, and then you reach the end and it's like, oh yeah, there's no actual mystery, so it kind of doesn't matter if he remembers everything perfectly or not, because there wasn't like a thing.
There wasn't the thing that ties it all together.
There is some very funny touches with that. One thing I noticed on this read through that I found very, very funny is that at the very beginning of his narration, he says, I'm not really going to bother with physical descriptions of anyone in this text, except I'm going to describe William to you real quick, because, he was just a really important person to me. And I think, me kind of explaining what he looked like to you will kind of give you some understanding of his character and kind of give me an into describing his character to you. But then he proceeds to give a physical description of almost every character that they run across over the course of the book, and not just a dispassionate physical description, but he's constantly referencing like whether people look trustworthy or strange or what he thinks that their appearance like belies. Which
that's interesting. You said that too. It's like I know you watched the movie. I didn't, but I watched the trailer and I felt like they made the monks look like goblins. And I was like, and I was enjoying when I was reading the book. I was like imagining normal looking people, and then when you see the movie, you're like, who are all these like Smeagol's and like it's like my precious books. I'm like, I thought that was an interesting decision on the movie's perspective. We don't have to get into that, but yeah, there is like a lot of physical description.
Yeah, I think we can talk about the adaptations maybe a little later. I will say the goblinoid proportions of the monks is the best part of that movie. But yeah, the very, very interesting there. I mean, I don't know that I was describing like normal people exactly. Like, again, I think Adso gives like pretty heightened descriptions of everyone. I found his description of there's an old mystic who lives at the monastery named Ubertino Casale, who's an actual historical figure. And Adso's constantly referencing him as like both being very old, but also like weirdly androgynous, which I found very interesting, especially when you kind of get into Ubertino as a character. Like he's a very misogynistic character who also like loves 3 particular women like incredibly deeply. But yeah, Adso like he contradicts himself like within a chapter. Like it's not something that is even kept to for like a period. Like this is not something that like Eco wrote and then forgot about. Like this is clearly a conscious choice on him as a writer to say one thing and then do another. And again, I think that it is all there because reading a detective novel, in my opinion, the whole point is because you want to be the detective.
Yeah.
You want to sit there and you want to get all the clues along with the characters, and then you want to see, am I going to beat Sherlock Holmes or, Hercule Poirot or whoever, Ms. Marple?
Okay.
Anyway, if you're going to beat them to solving the mystery. And most of the time you never do, because the mystery's been written in such a way that it's so contrived that you can't do it.
Right. And then you're just kind of in awe of the elegant description at the end. You're like, oh, exactly. What a perfect description of events.
Yeah, I've never read a Sherlock Holmes story and been like, oh, I figured this out before he did, which is the point at some level. And so again, Eco's misleading you the way he is with the conventions of detective fiction throughout. He wants you to be on the lookout for clues or inconsistencies, and they are there, and maybe at some level they belie some kind of meaning, but it's not an ultimate meaning. It's at the end of the day, it's a little fun thing for you to notice, and then it doesn't necessarily go much deeper than that.
Also, he says something in the postscript about how Adso's thing where he goes, I'm not going to talk about this, and then he talks about it, or like he sort of disavowal, like he sort of wonders if that was one of the reasons it was so popular, is because like one, that's kind of like, it doesn't say like, here is the thing about this. It's like Adso kind of going like, I don't have to talk about this, and then he does it anyway, and you're like, oh, okay. And then also like the fact that he doesn't know what's going on, and Eco says that's probably like the reader doesn't know. So there's like these sort of, religious schisms kind of flying over the reader's head, because you're more focused on like Adso and what does he know and what's he feeling.
Yeah, I mean, Adso is a great character.
Yeah,
like you really enjoy like being in his head, and he's a very likable character, which I don't know if I want to say I was surprised by, but it's very interesting that again Eco was able to take what should feel like a very alien perspective of this very kind of sheltered 13th century like young man, and like makes him feel like someone that you maybe know, maybe were. Just a very, very likable. I mean, all the characters are really eminently likable in this book, I think. Even though a lot of them are religious fanatics or various, shades of, there's the abbot again, who is this miser, but I still found like incredibly appealing, like just how taken he is with all the beautiful objects of the monastery. Like it's as someone who used to work in kind of the art world, something I found like very familiar, even if something I didn't find particularly sympathetic.
Right. Also, and William is very funny as well. And speaking of the relics, there's that bit where they see them and there's like hundreds of fragments of the cross, and like I think William says something just like, I mean, it must have taken a forest to kill Jesus, like with all these fragments. And then like Adso's like, Master, like how could you say that? Like, and
then he follows it up with an even better one where he says, when I was a boy, I was taken to a cathedral where I saw the head of John the Baptist when he was 6 years old. And Adso's like, what? But they killed John the Baptist. He was like 30 something. And William's like, yes, I think that head was in a different monastery.
Yeah. And then it's like, he said it with that peculiar English sensation of, I didn't know if he was joking or not, or something like,
yeah. Very, Eco clearly has like I think a kind of an odd streak of Anglophilia throughout this book. William's kind of, again, ultimately useless talents are somewhat imputed on his being English.
Yeah. He does a lot of hemming and hawing. It's described. It's like he's always like going and like so.
Yeah, very, very interesting for me as someone who obviously is immersed in the Anglo tradition, but loathes the Anglos. Very interesting seeing a continental finding something to like in those bog people.
Yeah, or like the I feel like there's something else in there too in terms of like the religious angle, where like the sort of, well, he certainly is like sympathetic to William. It's like, it's not where like he's more focused on like the Italian religious perspective that really comes through at one point, where like somebody says like they worship the saints really more than God. Yeah, like they're more into the saint.
Well,
like
William says that.
Oh yeah, so I guess he's putting the critique in William's mouth then, maybe. So
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. There's obviously a lot of religious content in this book, and there's this debate that's happening. This book takes place in kind of the shadow of the religious movements of the kind of late high Middle Ages, the Fraticellis, the Waldensians. The Dulcinians are probably the biggest kind of shadow over this book. And Eco does a very masterful job kind of grounding you in that, even if you don't have a super strong sort of base in that history, which I'm guessing even kind of a lot of modern Italians probably don't know a lot of the finer details of these theological disputes.
Yeah, the sort of radical sex, even like everything, like what with the Dulcinians, it was like everything is open to everyone, right? Sort of
there's an element here. I've been doing a lot of reading about the Reformation this year, and I think something I really appreciated about this book, and I think this will lead us into kind of a discussion of kind of some broader themes here. But this idea of that is, I think, less and less of an issue, but I think a pretty deep-seated issue in kind of Anglo tradition historiography, where the Middle Ages are portrayed as kind of the stable period until the Reformation, and then the Reformation shakes everything up and creates modernity, kind of out of the stinking corpse of feudalism, so to speak. And I really appreciate in this book, and I think this is kind of something that comes out of the continental tradition, or at least kind of the non-Anglo, non-Dutch perspective, is that, yeah, the Middle Ages were actually a time of like tremendous ferment in the church. It's not this incredibly stable, dull, or just pure decadent movement. There's a lot going on in people's religious lives, especially in Italy, because that's where all the religious activities going on. You had all these sects that were challenging papal authority, and you had, again, the King of France like creating a second pope just because he didn't want to deal with the first one.
And
Rome.
That pope is like, specifically in this book, John the 22nd, he is consolidating power. He's creating taxes to fund the church. He's incredibly wealthy. He does papal bulls against witchcraft, and also eventually shuts down the sort of poverty discussion. There's a lot of like power happening.
Yeah. And a lot of just, there's debate. There's, even though the Pope kind of eventually quashes it because he has managed to consolidate this power and wealth, like, it's not just this thing where you have all these blind, lemmings following whatever the pointy-headed king in Rome says.
Right.
There's a great scene. I loved the scene. It's before the debate, and they're talking about how, oh yeah, John has been reading Revelations, and there's this bit where the stone is rolled aside, and the elders are like brought out into like the presence of God and given white robes. And he's saying like that means that some people won't see heaven before the apocalypse. And he's explicating the doctrine of purgatory, which, Ben, you and I were both like raised, we both went to Catholic school.
Yeah.
We just grew up with that as like a accepted doctrine. But these priests and monks are freaking out about this. They're like, that leaves like everything like topsy-turvy. Like, the saints can't help us. Like,
right.
The whole like doctrine of indulgence, actually, they think it like threatens like indulgences, because if you're not going to get to heaven till the apocalypse anyway, like, why would you bother paying like for indulgences?
Yeah, and they're like, this is a bridge too far, as one of them says in that scene where they're discussing it. They're like, he goes too far with the beatific vision, so.
Yeah. But it's this interesting thing, and I think that this kind of gets to a topic I want to talk about. There is a sense in this book that the end of the world is coming.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, again, reading about the Reformation so much this last year. I think we both listened to the Hell on Earth mini-series from the Chapo Trap House guys, and that was a big theme of their show, is that in the 16th century, several centuries after this book takes place, people thought the world was ending. Because of the human need to look for meaning and symbols in the world, that is where apocalypticism comes from. We're always looking for the end of the world, and everything going on in the world is a symbol that the world is ending.
Well, and the end would sort of explain everything, which is a very Aristotelian idea, I would say. Like, the sort of the fulfillment of the thing explains the rest of it. So if you can sort of point to the end, everything will snap into place, basically.
Yeah. There are rumblings in this book of changes that, if you know history, are going to break out a long time later. there's an Italian monk who kind of tries to enlist William and Adso's help because he wants to get the library back into the hands of an Italian librarian. It's been in the hands of like foreigners for like several generations now, and the Italians think that that's wrong. So there's kind of these rumblings of this nationalism that's splitting the monastic community. And the Italians specifically want their hands on the library because they want to use the knowledge within to increase Italy's commercial fortunes.
Capital,
capitalism and modernity are the apocalypse that these people are foreseeing on the horizon, even if it's actually still 300-400 years off.
Well, speaking of that, there's a bit I just wanted to touch on briefly. So there's a bit where Adso is like confused and he wanders into the library and he basically sees the denouement before he knows what it means, which we don't have to talk about that right now. We could save that for later. But the thing I wanted to mention was he talks about books getting circulated and he imagines them as coins which lose their stamp. And he's like, well, maybe we should circulate knowledge. Maybe we shouldn't. But that like particular metaphor I thought was very interesting because there is a Nietzsche essay called On Truth and Lies in a Extra Moral Sense. And Nietzsche at one point argues that anything true is really just a metaphor that we've accepted as true. So like a figure of speech gets so worn down by circulation that it's a coin that loses its stamp and then it becomes a truth. So there's a weird kind of parallel there between like one, circulation, but two, the books, and also the idea that like this will all kind of become passe at some point. Like we'll have libraries and like that kind of stuff. So
and that's almost like, that's so interesting you say that, Ben, because that's kind of what like the apocalypse of John is, like the biblical book of Revelation is that, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but I do think, when we have kind of knowledge to bring in, I think that we want to do that. And we can, like I said, link stuff in the show notes to kind of support us. But did you know that the Orthodox Church does not have the book of Revelation as one of its canonical books in their Bible?
I didn't know that. Also, that makes sense, though, because I feel like wasn't John kind of out of it when he wrote it? I feel like it was written by by a crazy person. so it kind of makes sense like it wouldn't be in there.
I haven't read a ton on that portion. I don't know what the current scholarship is on John of Patmos, who's the writer of Revelation, and John the Apostle being the same person. I'm pretty sure that at certain points in history that those two were conflated. I'm guessing that there is no longer a consensus that they were the same guy. But the Book of Revelation, at least as my understanding of current biblical scholarship, the Book of Revelation was actually kind of an anti-Nero tract, basically, the Roman Emperor Nero. The references in there are basically they're all about the specific context of Christian persecution in that period of Roman history. And it's a work of metaphor, it's a work of propaganda. And in the Western Church, it became a cornerstone.
Yeah.
Because at some point, the things it was referencing were forgotten and weren't discovered until much, much later when people were kind of rereading these books. But the Eastern Church was like, yeah, we don't want that. And
we don't want the fuck Nero, all my homies hate Nero book. So,
or even just again, apocalypticism, it's a dangerous social force too. I mean, it leads to a lot of fucked up shit.
Which is what happens in this book too. Yeah.
And there's a reason a lot of Protestant churches don't have it as one of their canonical books. That doesn't stop a lot of crazy Protestants from taking it as biblically true, even if it's not like on their church's official Bible. But there's the apocalypse itself is a coin without a stamp. It's this image that has built up all this import to the point where a lot of people forgotten what it originally intended to mean.
And
that's so cool.
It might be worth mentioning too that the crazy old man who causes all this to happen, doesn't he think that it will happen? Isn't he convinced of the apocalypse happening? The main librarian.
I think again he's a committed Catholic in the 14th century. I think that he does at some level believe that. I don't know that he believes that he's bringing it about or anything like that.
What is Burgos? What is this? Yeah.
Do we want to just get into Jorge?
I mean, I feel like we've.
Were you talking about Alenardo?
No, Jorge, because I mean,
Okay.
you know, he's like, so at one point, these random murders are happening, and I believe William of Baskerville believes that maybe they're going according to revelations, and then Burgos Jorge finds out about this, and then deliberately has someone killed in order to like cement the connection. Um,
Yes.
and later he explains himself and says this was all God's plan. like I've done nothing wrong. This is all God's plan. I've protected the library. But he gives that like that apocalyptic sermon towards the end, which I might have to pull that because I wanted to look at it. But anyway, yeah.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about. So you referenced Aristotle a little bit earlier. We're talking a little bit about Jorge. Let's kind of get into the denouement bit. I know we kind of made a flippant reference earlier in our plot summary to kind of what happens at the end. So Jorge Burgos is kind of our mastermind here. I think we'll get to him in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about the joke book.
Yeah, it's a joke book. Yeah.
There is a twist in this novel, and that is at the end. They discover at some point that there is a book that they believe the murders are being done to hide, and they aren't sure why. It's a dangerous book. The monastery library is not a kind of traditionally, like, it's not like they censor works by like disposing of them. They even hold like works that they consider to be heretical or false because they believe that in that knowledge, like there can still be like useful things found, or like it's important to still have them so that you can like refer back to things you're refuting.
Yeah.
So there's this book that they know is involved in the murder. They can't figure out what it is. And then at the very end, they find out that it is the second volume of Aristotle's Poetics, which is the section which in real life was lost to history, as so many classical texts were. But it's the section that dealt with comedy. There are a lot of kind of earlier bits in the book where with this Jorge character, they debate the appropriateness of laughter for a monk, and whether or not Christ laughed. And yeah, basically this Jorge of Burgos, this old, very bitter, blind monk, has decided that no one can read the second volume of Aristotle's Poetics because God has essentially declared that laughter is inappropriate, and specifically he does not want people laughing at God or at religion,
and that it makes you susceptible to the devil, because if you laugh at the devil, then you no longer fear him. So the correct sort of response is not ridicule or a more reasoned stance. It's laughter allows you to be to fall into sin and depravity, and laughter should be banned. And if laughter is allowed to circulate, it will upset the whole established order. Suddenly everyone will be laughing at the received wisdom of the truth, and they'll no longer think that the apocalypse is coming, and they'll laugh at that too. So literally, like, it's like sort of like the order being undone. I also find it frankly astonishing that Eco has time to introduce this laughter theme at the end of this book. Like, I feel like he's been working like all of these, like, I'm sure they're debating laughter, but there's all these other themes in the book, and then like the laughter one sort of emerges from the end of the book, like Phoenix-like almost, and like suddenly it's like, oh, this is really about that as well. Like, I don't know, there's like a lot going on.
Earlier in the book, it comes across as a way to characterize William. I think it's a way of showing that he is this kind, there's this idea with William that he's kind of this enlightened, almost modern subject who is trapped in this world with all these religious fanatics. He's a believer in science and rationality and technology.
Flying machines.
Like, we can discover like flying machines and medicines and things like that. And it comes across as this way to really hammer home that like he's this enlightened person by kind of putting him up against this joyless, conservative, reactionary.
Dogmatic.
Who's Jorge. Who is also, as we'll get to here in a bit, he's also Borges.
Eco's like, what if I made Borges evil? Like,
but and then you find at the end, like, that was, if not the core, one of the cores of this book, is this laughter theme, and I think that it's it's a very concerning one at some level. I think that again, it's asking a lot of like kind of deep questions, because again, it's like, if you laugh at something, you're allowed to question it. And if you can question too many things, you can realize that things don't make sense. Things don't have these obvious meanings. And that is in some ways a very powerful, like, liberatory force. It's also like a terrifying force that can lead to a lot of social unrest and upheaval that might not lead to anything good.
Well, and I find it interesting that, like, in sort of the in lieu of having access to the stacks, if we wanted to use like a modern librarian term, Jorge basically could just tell you about it. So like, instead of going to look it up for yourself, you ask Jorge. Because like at some point you're like, who likes this guy? He's a real pain in the ass. Like anytime, you know, people are talking, Jorge shows up and they're like, fuck, Jorge's here. And, you know, then he ends up committing the murders. But his purpose is sort of like the authority, basically, and not sort of the sort of making, you know, finding out for yourself why something is the way it is.
Jorge,
you ask. Yeah.
I think it's time to just talk about Jorge a little bit.
Yeah.
We've been talking around him. I think we need to like really dig in, especially after I made that offhand comment. So Jorge is, I guess he's the closest thing the book has to an antagonist. I know Ben said he committed the murders. Not exactly correct, right, as we said. He's kind of the person, his action kind of kicks off the action of the plot before we even kind of enter the story. And then, you know, he kind of uses the opportunity that accident creates to further his ends. So he is a blind old man who basically knows this incredible library, which is laid out. We haven't even talked about the library. Wow. The library is a labyrinth that basically is designed to be confusing and to not be easily navigable, to protect these dangerous texts. So Jorge, kind of just by being he's the oldest monk in the library. He's blind, and he basically, by his own reading when he was younger and kind of being read to as an older person, he basically knows almost every book in the library. And that's how he discovered that there was Aristotle's Poetics in there, and decided that he needed to keep it locked away from people.
Censored.
And it's, again, like I said, he is actually, he's Borges. He's evil Borges. You know, the library itself is a Borgesian construction. It's this semi-absurd, surrealist kind of MC Escher-esque labyrinth that requires. There are at least two chapters of this book that are just dedicated to them, like, kind of working out the logic puzzle of the library.
And I feel like it's also a sort of a reference to the Infinite Library Borges story, because in that one, all of the rooms are hexagons, and Eco makes a clear point of saying these rooms are heptagons. So it's like to me, it's close, but it's like not an exact, you know, like if it was exactly hexagons, it'd be too on the nose. But
yes. And I think that it's I'm going to put on my Bluemite hat for a second. I think that it's a pretty clear case of kind of an anxiety of influence thing. I think that it's too on the nose to not be obvious. Jorge of Burgos, Borges. It's not subtle. Eco, I think, is even on the record as basically saying that yes, it's based on Borges. He knew he wanted to have like a blind man in the library, and then like it just kind of like grew up from there. Because if you have a blind man in a library, it's, if you're at all conversant with kind of like modern literature, it's Borges.
Well, and also like, and one of the reasons for that is Borges became the chief librarian in Argentina as soon as he turned blind.
Yes.
So he was in charge of all the books and he couldn't read them, which he said he found a delicious irony at the time. But to me, that reminds me of the Twilight Zone. If only I had enough time. And then like his glasses break because the world ends. He has no longer time to read the books because his glasses broke. It reminds me kind of that.
Well, and also there's I said anxiety of influence. Borges and Eco are like, Eco clearly has read and loves Borges. Like they both have a lot of the same themes of metatextuality and history of books and literature and of conspiracy and things like that. And I think that like putting evil Borges in this book, it's a way of, again, in that classic Bloomian sense, he's exercising like the ghost of his forebearer. Like he has to do it.
In the introduction,
he knows that this book is going to be compared to Borges, so he has to put Borges in there as the villain so that no one can accuse him of ripping off Borges.
Well, and too, the translator in the opening says, I translated this to free myself of persistent obsessions, which sounds to me like a anxiety of influence definition. If I ever heard one, I have to write about my influences to free myself from them. So it's like, I will make Borges the evil guy and he gets killed to make it clear. Yeah. Like you said, that of course someone's going to compare this to Borges. So one thing we haven't talked about yet is the actual mechanism by which the monks are poisoned. And I think it's a useful thing to bring up because this book has a very frequent, persistent, some might say unhealthy, some would say healthy preoccupation with books, reading as a thing you do, as a metaphor, as an act, the book of the world that you read to interpret. And, since the actual mechanism is putting poison on the pages and the pages stick together, so you lick your finger to turn the page, you're basically self-administering your own poison, which I think is kind of a nice metaphor for getting slowly ensnared in the infinite library, where you just love books so much they keep taking you from one book to the other until you're lost in unlimited semiosis. But also, it's sort of a nice distinction between bibliomania and bibliophilia, which is, I actually didn't know that there was a difference until I looked it up. But bibliomania is when you have a unhealthy OCD-like obsession with books, and bibliophilia is termed as this sort of healthy relationship with books. And I think the poison, the act by which they're killed is sort of a nice iteration of, there's like a very fine line between those two. And I think, you could easily cross from one into the other without realizing it, just as you can kind of administer your own poison. And I think, if we wanted to bring up unlimited semiosis again, once you start interpreting, it could be hard to know when to stop. And I think, Eco wants you to have, if you take him seriously on his goals for this book, which are an open work, which if you read the postscript, he says, I don't know what you're talking about, even though he's written scholarship on the open work, which is a work that creates the ideal reader and gives them a habit of interpretation, which will hopefully provide them with, success, at least some knowledge of something, even if it's a little unstable. So I think there's a nice thing going on in this book between what's a healthy love of books and what's an unhealthy love. And I thought it kind of relates to like the poison too. So yeah,
I think that there's a great passage here that I think really explicates this and kind of lays out the kind of position the monks existed in regards to books. So this takes place on the second day. The book is broken down into 7 days. The second day after the William and Adso have arrived, one of the monks comes up and tells them that he saw a ghost, the ghost of the first monk who died, Adelmo of Otranto, who was the illuminator. He saw him in outside the monastery, his ghost, and his ghost said he was in hell. And the next morning his body was discovered, and he tells William and Adso this, and it comes out later that he had basically used his position in the library to get Adelmo to sleep with him for access to the poetics, which Adelmo wanted because he was a great talent with comedic illustration and wanted to learn more about comedy. But William basically hears this guy out and then sends him away. And Adso is like, what have you realized now that that there was a ghost? And he's like, William says, my dear Adso, that ghost does not seem very ghostly to me. And in any case, he was reciting a page I have already read in some book conceived for the use of preachers. These monks read perhaps too much, and when they are excited, they relive visions they learned from books. I don't know whether Adelmo really said those things or whether Berengar simply heard them because he had needed to hear them. The fact remains that this story confirms a series of my suppositions. For example, Adelmo died a suicide, and Berengar's story tells us that, before dying, he went around in the grip of a great agitation and in remorse for some act he had committed. He was agitated and frightened about a sin because of someone had frightened him, and perhaps had told him that very episode of the infernal apparition that he recited to Berengar with such hallucinated mastery.
Yeah, he was kind of shocked into the book, so he was so intense that he just starts kind of quoting things, or he turns to the book to explain it. So,
well, again, I think that there is a tendency among people, perhaps people like ourselves, where you read books to I think, and tell me if this is wrong. I know that for me, I read books at a certain point in my life because I thought they were going to give me a better understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And then you at some point realize that narrative and reality don't reflect each other the way you quite thought that they did. But that doesn't remove the desire for them to reflect each other the way that you think that they do.
Right.
Especially in moments of kind of heightened emotion. It's very easy to kind of want to narrativize your life and to put yourself into a familiar story, because then you can understand the ending.
Yeah.
Because again, Adelmo, it comes out he did commit suicide. Like he did do this thing that he felt terrible about. Or wait, actually, we might need to edit this. Did he commit suicide? Fuck.
Right, because he was, I thought he committed suicide. Well, but if he fell out of the window, wasn't it because he because of the relationship he had, he was so ashamed, I think he committed suicide, didn't he?
Okay.
Unless I misunderstand it.
I'm going to look this up real quick. We can edit this part out.
I still think it would be funny to keep it in, because it's man, it's some of the plots of this book, it's you don't know exactly what happens. You just know that, making sense of it all is so hard. So
yeah, I mean, we'll I'll leave that to you as the editor. Did he commit suicide? Come on, tell me. Okay, yes, he did commit suicide.
Yeah, because of the shame of having that relationship that was a sin for knowledge. So.
Okay, sorry.
Well, one thing I also wanted to say was, much like he's scared into sort of the reciting the vision multiple times, or at least the main one I'm thinking of, when Adso has that sexual experience with the woman, he starts quoting the Song of Songs. And so he's just sort of and Eco describes writing it in the back as he's I didn't plan it. I just had a bunch of quotes from Song of Songs, and I was typing, and I would incorporate a quote here, incorporate a quote there. But the sort of the other book takes over almost when he's having that sexual experience, because it's romantic and sexual imagery that's in the Bible. So the Song of Songs.
Well, and again, I think that's kind of, again, I think that's a message of this book, is as much as we think, again, kind of to loop us back around, I know we're getting long in the tooth here, and I think we want to start getting to the end here. I think that there's a sense here where, again, we all have this idea that we're sort of these, again, we're these monadic minds walking through the world and observing things, but we're a lot more permeable than that. And one of the things that permeates us is symbols and narratives and stories, and they influence us, and they embed themselves in us, and they come out in unexpected ways. And that's a big part, I think, of why we love literature in a way.
Yeah,
we enjoy that feeling of permeability, and the way that you can read something and see yourself, or see something familiar in it and something alien, and all these things. It's a theme I'm sure we'll keep developing as we go through this show. But yeah, I think this is a book about loving to read.
Yeah, and also how it'll change you. So like you're saying, we're not really monads, and we do kind of change when we read or interpret something, especially deeply. So
that changing isn't necessarily a perfecting in any means. It's a messy and strange process, but it's beautiful in a way. It's a great and terrible becoming.
Well, and I want to add too, if we go to the very end, at one point William quotes a quote unquote German mystic, which is actually a Wittgenstein quote, about how you have to climb the ladder and then kick the ladder away. So like, just because you take something to be true almost means you have to kind of at the same time move past it and become something else, and that you can't stick to one thing for too long. So
if you see the Buddha in the street, kill him.
Yeah. Also the Buddha is a shit stick is something that reminds me of the bit where he's talking about how one of the monks, there's a story the Franciscans used to tell where they asked, instead of food, he said, "Oh, I need a relic." And then he drops it in the shit and goes, "Oh, he's fallen into the latrine. Somebody help him." Like, to sort of like demonstrate. They're like, I don't care about this. I care about like actual interacting with people, not holy relics or whatever. But
yeah, wow, we didn't even get into like the class themes in this book at all. Wow.
Yeah, or the like, yeah, the how heresy is kind of like a thing that everyone does. I think William tries to argue that like everyone is a heretic at some point. So,
man, I think that just kind of to explicate, I think what our goal is here. I think that we're going to realize this a lot over the course of our conversations here. We're never going to get to everything, folks.
Yeah,
there's just a reality that in an hour to 90 minutes, you cannot discuss everything in a 500-page book, or even a shorter book than that.
And you can't read all the books in the infinite library. There will always be another book.
There will always be more. But, the idea here is, I think the idea here is not that we're doing this to replace you reading these books. We're doing this to maybe be a companion, where you can hopefully find things you enjoy, or reflect on things you've already read, maybe look at them in a new way. But before we kind of wrap up here, I do want to take a minute. Like Ben had mentioned earlier, I did watch the 1986 Sean Connery vehicle, The Name of the Rose. Which is
The Name of the Rose. Yeah, I can't do a Sean Connery.
He's surprisingly like not obnoxious in that movie. I think because everyone is kind of on his level.
Okay,
in a weird way, except the guy playing Adsa, who's like a young Christian Slater, who's just kind of being, 17-year-old Christian Slater, and just kind of being like a pretty boy, which is fine.
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting, for a book that is all about books. This is a book that there have been a lot of attempts to adapt this work over the years.
Yeah.
So there's the 1986 movie. There is the 2018 miniseries, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And then there's at least, I think, 2 video games.
One of the video games was even updated. La Abadía del Crimen came out and then was also like updated to come out again. You can actually download it for free on Steam.
Yeah, I don't think either of us got a chance to play that, but maybe that'll be something we do down the line here and give an update on. But
and
the
there's
movie,
a board game too, the
yes,
Mystery of
there's
the
a board
Abbey.
game.
Yeah, which is the famous Italian game designer Bruno Feduti. Was like, what if Clue was better? So, but
yeah, it's just very interesting. I guess it just speaks to how successful this book was at the time that so many people wanted to adapt it. Because if you had not told me there was an adaptation of this, I don't like my knee-jerk instinct on this is that it's unadaptable.
yeah,
Like there's just too much here to fit into another art form. I think that something I'm sure we'll talk about more. What do books do that other art forms don't? And I think one thing they do is just density.
yeah.
A movie cannot waste the time to have a detailed explanation of the Dulcinian heresy.
Or the amount of lists that are in this book, which is another thing we didn't get to. Eco loves lists, and I think you can't really represent a list like a sort of compulsion to different like nouns and like descriptive properties as well, on film. So
yeah, and even like the library in the movie does not come across as nearly as strange and surreal a landscape as it does in this book. They do their best, but it's hard to do. I will say it is a wonderful movie just for the character work in it. I'm not a huge Connery fan, but he does a pretty good job. It's really a joy because you have the weirdest looking group of character actors I think I've ever seen in a movie. There's been a lot of ink spilled in the last couple of years about how everyone in Hollywood has to be like a hot Ken doll now, and how it makes movies suck. And I absolutely agree with that. Watch 1986's Name of the Rose for like an antidote to that, because there's not, aside from young Christian Slater, there's not a single like normal or attractive looking person on screen. Everyone, like Ben says, looks like an absolute goblin. In particular, the absolute god, one of my favorite actors in all of human history, Ron Perlman, as Salvatore, a character we did not get to, but who is one of the MVP characters in this book.
Holy shit.
Yeah, in some wild prosthetics, just being the weirdest, ugliest guy in a movie full of weird, ugly looking guys.
And Abbey full of character actors.
Yeah. Berengar, the assistant librarian, looks like Uncle Fester. It's great.
The Abadia del Crimen, I think, borrowed the imagery from the movie, because if you look at the sprites, they look like people from the movie. I noticed that when I was looking at the game.
I'll have to check that out. But oh man, after I watched the movie, I was like, I was watching with my partner, and they mentioned that they thought we were going to be watching the 2018 miniseries, and I was like, "There's a 2018 miniseries?" And I looked it up, and yeah, there was. It was I think like a German-Italian BBC co-production.
Sounds promising.
And then it is one of the worst. I watched 2 episodes. Maybe it gets better. I'm not going to find out. Probably one of the worst pieces of shit I think I've ever seen. Imagine if somebody read this book and was like, "What if I made it Game of Thrones?" Like it literally starts with a battle scene, because it like takes the thing where like Adso's like, yeah, my father was a baron and like he was involved in like the invasion of Italy for the emperor, and it's like, oh, his father like brought him there to like learn to fight even though he was already a monk. And it's like,
I'm just imagining the George Lucas, like, we get to see that. Oh, we get to go there. We get to see the battle that Adso's father was in. Don't you want to see that? like it's really good.
And then it's got John Turturro as William, which is, I like John Turturro, but he's the most Italian looking motherfucker in the world. Why is he playing an English guy?
Yeah, we couldn't. Yeah.
It's just it sucked. It's got all this,
wait, John, that's why he got assigned to Italy, because he was the most Italian looking Englishman that he could know their ways and talk to them.
But yeah, it does all this stuff where like it's cutting it's doing like a lot of like Game of Thrones stuff where it's like cutting between different places and like people, like there's a lot of scenes like with like John and Bernard of Guy, who's the Inquisitor character we didn't really get too much.
We didn't talk about him either.
And like they're like plotting against William before they like get to the delegation. There's a bunch of flashbacks with the Dulcinians, and it's dog shit. Do not no one watch it. No one watch it.
Well, that sounds like an interesting sort of modern TV solution to the density, but two, like the world building, because like, you know, as much as these people relate these things, we don't ever really leave the Abbey. We're there the whole time at the book. So
well, that's the thing, you know, that's why, again, I think that like there are filmmakers, I think, who can be constrained that way. But I think with film, and I'm counting TV as film, even though I think there's a lot of fundamental differences there. There's always the temptation to show. And there's the show don't tell maxim that a lot of people, especially in commercial art, really live by. Whereas Eco does not live by that. He loves just telling.
Telling you and using as many different words as possible to tell you something as well. So
and I think that especially with TV, you can't tell, you have to show. And it gives you too much power to break those boundaries. And I think that it really misses a very key part of this text. And I
could imagine like a version of this that's more cued into the detective plot, but then uses flashbacks like really appropriately, so that it's not like it's like only flashbacks happen at like really important moments, and then the rest of it is like you're just there doing the mystery. So you know, there's absolutely ways you could do that, but I think that, you know, again, in a post Game of Thrones world, it's like if you're doing a medieval story, you have to make it sexy and violent. And there's like sex and violence in this book, but it's not sexy and violent, if that makes sense. If anything, it's like the books are sexy. It's like it's all about getting really turned on by reading and not actual sex or violence.
Because actually having sex drives you crazy.
And like Adso gets upset when he has sex.
All right. Well, I think that this is a pretty good place to tie it off for today. Just want to thank all of you for, like I said at the opening, you know, taking a chance on the show. I think Ben and I are very excited to see where this project goes from here, and we hope that you'll come back and join us here in the future. Do want to take a minute to kind of explicate what our plans are for the foreseeable future. We are planning on a bi-weekly release schedule, just kind of given the length of time that reading a book takes compared to watching a movie or something like that. You know, this is a 500-page book. That's not something you can do in one evening when you both work full-time like we do. So planning on a bi-weekly release schedule. It might be sprinkling some things in those off weeks here and there as we go. We are going to be as funny as it kind of is to do this right after our first episode, we're going to be doing kind of a theme month for October. Spooky season is with us, and the skeletons are coming out of their crypts, and we're going to be dancing with them.
We're going to be having a hoedown, you know, books. We're going to be reading books with them. Books lead to other books. So,
so we're going to be doing a horror themed month for October. And I think we were talking a little bit before this. Our next episode, given kind of the serendipity of Adelmo of Otranto, we're going to be reading the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. So we hope you will join us in 2 weeks for that. Really looking forward to discussing that with you, Ben.
Same, John.
Anyone wants to follow the show, you can get on Twitter, which I'm still insisting on calling Twitter, and follow us at Infinite Library Pod. You can follow me at Slut Goblin King. Ben, where can the lovely people find you?
I guess you can follow me on It's Been 1 Week. Maybe you'll get the pun in there on Twitter, but I also am on that on Blue Sky, because I feel like everyone's running to the exits as they do every so often on Twitter. So
Yeah, we'll have a Blue Sky account set up for the show here as soon as we can get an invite. I'm also on Blue Sky at Slut Goblin King. If you want to follow me there, I haven't fully made that transition yet. I need to here in the near term, but
yeah,
for the time being.
We're gonna start the first book Twitter, but it's on Blue Sky. we're gonna start book Blue Sky, and you listeners can join us. So,
yeah, you can also email the show at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast. Show notes will be posted in the description, where you can find references to all the other books and articles and things we've used to put together our show today. Yeah, Ben, anything else you have to say to the lovely people?
I welcome that when I will see you guys in the Infinite Library, because John and I live here and we want more people to hang out with us. So,
well, yeah, then we'll call it a day here. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day and keep reading books.
Keep reading books, folks.
Semper Books.
All right, you definitely got to leave that in, Semper Books. Yeah, that'll be, the music will start fading in right as you hear Semper Books. So.